Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lars Grosse-Wortmann. I'm the division head of Peds Cardiology. I welcome you all to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Today is not any Grand Rounds, it's actually Casden Day, and you know that because a whole bunch of cardiologists show up to Grand Rounds. I'm particularly excited to welcome a lot of our former faculty, former fellows, either online or in the room, so thank you all for coming today. So what's Casden? For those of you who don't know the history of Casden, very briefly, it's a day that in cardiology we come together for learning, for enjoying each other's company and discussion, and for furthering our knowledge. And that was really made possible by the generous donation of the Casden family many, many decades ago. And it allowed us really to invite over time the who's who of pediatric cardiology, cardiac intensive care, congenital heart surgery to Portland and learn from them and stimulate our conversations and discussions. And you can see here the list that really it is peppered with the most prominent people in the field over the last 4 or 5 decades. Before I hand it over to Dr. Silberbach to introduce our speaker for today, who truly deserves a place on this list for sure, I do want to alert you all to the second talk that our speaker is going to give to us today at 4:30 in the CDRC 3200, 4:30 to 5:30, also in person, but with a virtual option. And that talk is going to be titled Human Migration and Ancestral Origins of an Atrial Fibrillation Gene. And I find that's at least as timely as the talk that he's going to give to us now, because it really reminds us that within all this talk of separation, nationalism, and even segregation all around the world, human evolution is complex, and really we are all much more similar than we are different. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Silberbach. I'll speak a little slowly so he can finish chewing and come up here to the stage to introduce our speaker today. I should mention before I do that Dr. Silberbach was really the mastermind behind this year's Casden. It was all his fault, and he pulled it all together with Hannah and Jessica, and I'm really, really grateful. So Professor Emeritus, Dr. Silberbach.
Thank you, Lars. I really don't want to take up too much of Dr. Tristani's time, but I would like to take a moment to tell you how excited I am about Dr. Tristani's visit. So how do I get the next slide? Do I just click left here? There we go. So let me just start with this quotation that I found from Dr. Tristani. Genetics is not the answer to everything. Some people don't get enough exercise, cannot access the health care they need, or are experiencing the environmental consequences of climate change. These are a small sampling of the lifestyle, social, and environmental factors that are having major impacts on our health. Talented researchers are working on all of these facets of health. It will take all of us in the social, physical, and health sciences, as well as the humanities and arts, to make the world a better and healthier place. And that, I think, is Dr. Tristani's message from what I've read about him and what I know about him. And I know that he's devoted to teaching. And a friend of mine and fellow University of Minnesotan, Susan Etheridge, is sitting right next to Dr. Tristani in this picture, and then surrounded by his fellows. And it's the real reason that he didn't do the Casden when we usually do at the beginning of December, because he didn't want to miss his fellows clinic and didn't have time to make the changes. So here we are. But we're so happy to have Dr. Tristani here. And I spoke with Susan Etheridge, who was indeed his intern when he was a medical student. And he, like everybody else, including David Bailey, just loves him. They describe, and Susan describes him as a visionary scientist, years ahead of his colleagues, with powerful ideas and without the obligatory dude dominant persona. And I think we're learning that today, and I see it and feel it every time I've spoken with him. But just to say briefly, I think looking at his CV, it really says a lot, because there are 4 lines as far as his education goes. He was a medical student. He went to Collegeville, St. John's in Minnesota above Minneapolis. He went to the University of Minnesota as a medical student, a resident, a fellow, and then without further ado, he moved to the University of Utah, where he's been for, I believe, more than 20 years. You know, and he's not the chairman of this department. He's not doing anything. He's not collecting degrees. He's focusing on what he thinks his purpose is. And I think this quotation really summarizes that. But, you know, I do need to tell you what kind of scientist he is. He has 3 multi-PI grants, 3 U grants. He's got 2 R01s, and that's just what he's got currently. He's been continuously funded for the last 25 years. He has 127 publications in PubMed. And, you know, they're all on topics that are fundamental to pediatric cardiology, congenital heart disease, and genetics. He's currently the co-director of genomic medicine at the University of Utah. And if any of you know, I'm sure you do, University of Utah is sort of the birthplace of understanding family genetics because of their incredible ancestry registry. And so what he's going to talk about today, I'm sure there'll be some cardiology thrown in there, but this notion of using the public record, of using the electronic health record, using what we know about clinical pediatricians and clinical cardiologists to leverage all that information in large databases. And this is the kicker, and this is why I thought this was such a great Grand Rounds presentation, because it's going to use he wants to use large language models, Bayesian logic, in order essentially chat GPT for medicine, and to use that to understand the history of disease, but also to develop personalized medicine. And so, you know, all the bad things going on in this world, this is the future. And even though he's got a bad back right now, he's a young man, and he is our future in terms of where medicine is going. So I'm so glad to have him here and to welcome. And I just want to say one other thing, because I know that one of Dr. Tristani's interests is figuring out how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be used in these large language models to understand health outcomes and understand its role in making ourselves a better and healthier society. So I'm sorry that was long, but I just love this guy, and I'm sure you will also. So thank you, Dr. Tristani, and let's move forward.
Well, thank you, Dr. Silberbach. That is a very emotional introduction, and I didn't realize that you were able to find this quote, which I agree is very powerful. But how you found it, I'm not sure. So kudos to you. I would like to thank first and foremost the Kasdan family for the philanthropy that has funded these lectures over all the years. And thank especially Dr. Silberbach for the invitation to speak today. I apologize with all my heart for not being there in person. I would absolutely do it if it was possible, but unfortunately, that's not the reality. But it really is an honor to be considered in the group of people that Lars showed on that first slide. Those have really been the leaders, the thought leaders in the field of pediatric cardiology, and I'm humbled to be considered in that line. I'm going to try and share my screen here. All right, and here we go. And let me just get a pointer here. And I just want to confirm that people can hear me okay. If anyone online can just jump on and say yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah. So at this point, I can't see anybody. If there's any questions, feel free to interrupt me. I know it's hard when it's a virtual talk like this, but I'm happy to answer any questions along the way. So what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is our experience in Utah in the field of integrating artificial intelligence, big data, and genomics for precision medicine in pediatrics. A lot of what I will talk about will be pediatric cardiology, but there's also some broader concepts in general pediatrics as well. So I have no relevant disclosures. The overview here is I'd like to introduce the idea of whole genome sequencing in critically ill children. Then we'll switch gears and discuss computing on electronic health records using explainable forms of artificial intelligence, and then describe our efforts in integrating genomics with clinical data for personalized risk estimation, and then just close with some final thoughts. So first and foremost, what is precision medicine? It has a lot of different definitions. I just want to get clear what we're thinking about, or what I'm thinking about in terms of precision medicine. People have described this as providing the right treatment to the right patient at the right dose and the right time. That's kind of a global way of thinking about precision medicine. A little bit more specifically, though, it's really combining an individual's genomic and multi-omic profile. So multi-omics would include proteomics, transcriptomics, meaning RNA, or any other type of biological signal, integrating that with genomics and clinical information, and importantly, together with social determinants of health in order to guide diagnosis, therapy, and intervention. And social determinants of health are certainly not genomic-based, but they're a principal driver of outcomes. And we can find situations where in the right setting of events, social determinants of health and genomics integrate together and work cooperatively to have adverse outcomes. And so understanding this big picture of all the information we can get our hands on is really the theme of what we need in order to arrive at the correct risk predictions moving forward. So this is what precision medicine is not. For the older members of the audience, you might remember this film from the late 1990s with some super famous people in it. And this is not what precision medicine is about. It's not eugenics. So the Precision Medicine Initiative really took hold back in 2015 with then President Obama creating this Precision Medicine Initiative that really unleashed hundreds of millions of dollars for research in the space of precision medicine. And if we ask ourselves a decade on, have we fulfilled this promise of precision medicine? Well, apart from precision oncology, there's very few specialties that have integrated genomics or precision medicine into their routine clinical care. Think about your own practice. Pharmacogenomics was really touted as a promising avenue, but that just is not integrated into our EHR and very difficult to use. Undiagnosed disease clinics across the country actually are a very good sort of use case for precision medicine. But I would argue that rapid genome sequencing of critically ill children really is the vanguard of precision medicine. This is where precision medicine is happening right now, today, and it's moving across the country like a tsunami. So what I'd like to do throughout this talk is just talk about our journey here in Salt Lake City at the University of Utah and Primary Children's Hospital towards broad-scale precision pediatric medicine. And we're starting off here just at the beginning of the journey. So back in December of 2019 and in early 2020, we started two programs, one at the University of Utah and the other at Primary Children's, both geared toward rapid whole genome sequencing in the university and primary children's newborn intensive care units. And this concept was really revolutionized and spearheaded by Dr. Stephen Kingsmore, first at Children's Mercy Kansas City and later at Rady, where he is now at UC San Diego. And these programs, because there was no support from insurance, these were both started with philanthropy. This data is from a grant, a multi-center grant that we didn't get funded for, unfortunately, but it included 3 sites: Children's Mercy Kansas City, Indiana University, and the University of Utah and Primary Children's. And it highlights the variation that we see in ordering genetic testing across medical centers and in diagnostic yields. So this is data that includes admissions to both the level 4 NICU as well as the cardiac ICU. And you can see that at CMKC, about 1/3 of patients would get a genetic test. At Indiana, almost 70% of patients are getting a genetic test. And in Utah, about half patients admitted to our level 4 NICU or our cardiac ICU are getting a genetic test ordered. Now we're going to switch over here to this side here and look at the diagnostic yield of these modalities. So at CMKCU and IU, it was a combination of both clinical exomes and clinical genomes. And you can see their hit rate is about 24% for a genetic variant that explained the phenotype that the patient had. In Utah, this was just rapid whole genome sequencing trios right here, and our hit rate was 34%. So when you look nationally about the hit rate on genome sequencing, whether it's rapid genome sequencing, it's around 24 to upwards of 40%. So in Utah, we were able to advocate at the state level, both for Utah Medicaid and the primary insurance coverer, which is Select Health. And both of these entities now cover rapid whole genome sequencing for critically ill children, which is now the standard of care in Utah. But there was really a defining moment in precision medicine that happened back in September 2023. And this is when Fabric, Genomics, and the Broad announced a $1,000 clinical certified or CLIA certified whole genome test. This is not rapid, by the way, but just to put this in the context of the types of charges that we see every day. So in Utah, an echocardiogram costs $2,000 to $4,000, depending upon the setting and the modality. And then in the concept across the country, the average first hospitalization for a pediatric heart transplant is $827,000. So I don't think people think twice about ordering an echocardiogram in the cardiac ICU or in a post-op patient when you're concerned about something, right? So in that context, $1,000 for a test, which is a living test, this is a genome that could live on and go with the patient as the patient goes throughout life and new phenotypes arise. This $1,000 test is really starting to bring this into the world where it's almost a no-brainer. And so at that time, in September of 2023, we approached our administrators at Primary Children's Hospital, and we said, listen, our current standard of care for all children undergoing cardiac surgery is a chromosomal microarray, or CMA. That costs about $750. Now we have a new test. It's a little bit more. It's $1,000, but there's added value to that test. And the administrators agreed that there is added value, and we have subsequently shifted from doing the chromosome microarray to doing a genome on all children undergoing congenital heart surgery in the first year of life. So this is our general protocol here. Patients are admitted to the cardiac ICU, and we evaluate their inclusion and exclusion criteria. If they meet the criteria for trio-based rapid whole genome sequencing, they'll get that. If it's clear that this is a trisomy 21 or 18 or 13 patient, well, they'll get a different test. Apart from that, they will get what we call our proband only whole genome, which is not a rapid test. Part of the power of this system that we've set up with the companies is that we will get that raw data back That data is in the form of what's called a CRAM file, and we have our own analytical tools that we can requery that genome when new issues arise in the patient. So we have almost just a little under 1 year of results. So 71 families agreed to consent to this proband only genome. And in 11% of the cases, there was a diagnostic smoking gun hit. And another 11%, there was a variant of uncertain significance, which was flagged by the commercial genetic testing company. But the clinical team thought that was explanatory and returned that result to the family. So in general, we've got a 22% hit rate. And there's some key points to consider here, and that is this cohort is already depleted of strong Mendelian disease because any patient that qualified for rapid genome sequencing got rapid genome sequencing. The other key point here is that none of these patients would have been diagnosed with the CMA. The CMA is looking for large deletions and duplications. So it's really good at picking up Williams syndrome and DeGeorge syndrome. But these patients actually had point mutations that would have been missed by the CMA. And kind of the sort of summary of this experience is that the more we sequence, the more we identify Mendelian disease. We have not saturated our sequencing in the cardiac ICU or in the newborn intensive care unit at this time with our current sort of selection modalities. So the more that we sequence, the more patients we identify. And the other really important thing is that every genome tells a story. There isn't enough time to, in this particular talk, to tell some of those stories, but I do want to say that overwhelmingly the response of families that have had genome sequencing has been a positive experience for them, even if they didn't get a positive result. So kind of moving along on our journey, we've made some progress toward precision pediatric medicine, but still a long ways to go. And what I'd like to do next is sort of shift the discussion away from pure genomics in the context of precision medicine and into the context of big data and big data analytics, especially data residing in the electronic health records. So there's a word of caution here. There is a creepy side of big data analytics. So a few years back, Target computer scientists realized that 25 store products that when analyzed together allowed Target to assign each shopper a pregnancy prediction score and estimate her due date. And the goal here is that Target would mail out coupons for baby products to those individuals that met that pregnancy prediction score criterion. And back in 2012, this story hit the social media, describing how Target figured out a teen girl was pregnant before her father did. So this was reported in a lot of news outlets, including the Forbes. It's not clear that this is really a true story, to be honest. When people dig in deeper, it's not really clear that the father went to Target and complained about this. That would be, just not a likely possible event. But the idea is that we do need to be careful when we're looking at people's data without their permission. So when we think about how much data is available in the electronic health record, how much genomic data is available, what do all those individual genomic sequences mean, we're really drowning in a sea of data. And understanding the contribution of genetic variants to a patient's risk for disease remains challenging. Computing on millions of electronic health records is a daunting challenge. And these solutions can only come about based on artificial intelligence-based technologies. It's the only way that you can compute at this scale and analyze at this scale. And I'd like to explain this slide a little bit. There's a trade-off between what we call explainability and AI performance. And so in this graph here, we have increasing explainability, meaning more explainable, less explainable. And this is the performance. And deep learning tools, our AI forms, like neural networks, are incredibly powerful for predictions. The problem with them is they're black boxes. You don't know how the computer algorithm arrived at the solution. but the solution is incredibly strong and incredibly predictive. Bayesian belief nets and Bayesian networks sit somewhere in between here, so they're definitely more explainable than these black box methods. Their performance is a little bit more limited, so there are things that you can only do with neural nets that you can't do with Bayesian networks. But there's this trade-off between how you want to be explainable and how is your performance. So in that context, we've published, and by we, I mean my colleagues, Dr. Mark Yandel, who's a computer scientist and bioinformatician and one of the most brilliant people that I know. So this has been our experience in deploying AI-based analytical tools for risk prediction across electronic health record data sets at the University of Utah. And we've also been able to integrate, importantly, social determinants of health and how they interact with other clinical variables in the prediction of stroke in adult patients with atrial fibrillation. I'm not going to go into detail on that. But what I'd like to show you here is what these tools can do and how we represent the data in these tools. So this graph right here is a visual graph of the entire contents of the University of Utah electronic health record, which is represented in what we call a patient disease network. And embedded in here are 1.6 million patients. There's 40,000 diagnostic codes, 57 procedure codes, 1,700 medication codes, and there's 50 million relationships. So each little tiny dot is a diagnostic procedure or a medication code, and the connections between them are statistically significant relationships. So it means that diagnosis A co-occurs with diagnosis B at a rate greater than what you would expect for chance alone. And this is, of course, corrected for multiple corrections testing. The important thing here is there's no PHI. This is just relationships. And now I've mapped on a series of diagnostic codes and some medications here. When we zoom in on this little cluster, what you can see is that diagnoses that are highly co-occurring or highly related cluster together in the same cluster. So we see atrial fibrillation, cardiomyopathy, heart failure, etc. So one way we deploy this is in what's called a temporal network. So this is a series of variables happening before a heart transplant and after a heart transplant using University of Utah data. And if we look here, we focus on ischemic heart disease. So if a patient gets a diagnosis of ischemic heart disease, almost 20% of them will later get a diagnosis of heart failure. After you get a heart failure diagnosis, 3.5% will go on to develop cardiogenic shock. 32% of those individuals will get on milrinone. If you're on milrinone, 5% of those individuals will go on to get a heart transplant, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is telling us what the transition or what the risk of going from one diagnosis to another is. When you want to ask questions about multiple variables and their ability to predict risk, then you have to get into the AI-based tools system. So for example, in the next slides, we're going to talk about what's the impact of having a cardiomyopathy diagnosis and being on milrinone on the risk of a transplant. And let me show you what that looks like. But before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about Bayesian networks and why they are such a powerful, explainable form of artificial intelligence. So these Bayesian networks are able to model complex nonlinear relationships between variables. And one of the key features here that you're going to hear about again in this lecture is that they can capture and measure non-additive, that means synergistic impacts. And I'm going to give you these examples in the next few slides. Unlike multivariate logistic regression, these Bayesian nets allow for multiple independent queries within a single model. And then importantly, the Bayesian networks are well known for their ability to predict risk even when you have small numbers of data. So this is a Bayesian network that describes the variables that increase the risk or influence the risk of cardiac transplantation. All these variables were in that other temporal net that I showed you, but they're kind of rearranged here in the context of the Bayesian network. And we're just going to focus on two variables here and their impact on the risk of heart transplant. So if a patient has a diagnosis of cardiomyopathy, their risk of transplant is 86-fold over baseline. And let me just quickly explain, how do we get these confidence intervals here? So we create a Bayes net and we run calculations. Then we repeat creating a brand new Bayes net and we calculate this risk. And we do that 10,000 times. And then we're able to generate confidence intervals over this, this risk prediction right here. So if a patient is on milrinone, their lifetime risk of having a transplant is 175-fold over baseline. Well, what about if you have both those diagnoses or medications? A patient on milrinone with a diagnosis of cardiomyopathy, they have an increased risk of transplant 407-fold over baseline. So it's not the sum of these two, it's synergistic. And this is one of the key features of the Bayesian networks. And I'm going to provide additional examples as we move forward here about these synergies and the ability of the Bayesian networks to capture these non-additive risk factors. So again, milrinone and cardiomyopathy diagnosis synergize to increase the risk of cardiac transplantation. The other thing we can do with these data is we can say, okay, let's talk about mom's health and what is the risk of her child or her fetus having any form of disease in the context of mom's health. So in here, we're looking at a maternal diagnosis of pregnancy-induced hypertension with a whole series of other variables related to the child. And so what we find is that pregnancy-induced hypertension increases the risk of congenital heart disease in the fetus 1.7-fold. So this is telling us how we can calculate these, transgenerational findings. Now, this idea that pregnancy-induced hypertension increases the risk of congenital heart disease has already been shown. When we published this paper, we needed to show some sort of proof of concept that, yes, that we could recapitulate some of the other findings, and this was indeed what we showed as an example of that. But what the net allows us to do is ask a bunch of questions about the child. And so we can say that if the mother has pregnancy-induced hypertension and we know the child has congenital heart disease, well, there's an 11-fold risk that that child will also have a neurological defect. So this is really helpful in creating what we call these like apps for predicting risk in a patient when that child or when that mother or child is sitting right in front of you. So again, more progress now in our goals of precision pediatric medicine, but still a long ways to go. So next, I'd like to introduce this concept of how we integrate genomic information with clinical variables to empower risk estimation. And this is a study which was a collaboration between the Pediatric Heart Network and the Pediatric Cardiac Genomics Consortium, or PCGC. And it consists of 304 single ventricle patients who had whole exome sequencing and a series of clinical variables, including the Bayley scales of infant development and length measurements later in life. And what we wanted to do is look at damaging genetic variants and see if we could make risk predictions about who would go on to have low Bayley scores or poor growth. So this is a complicated slide, and I'll kind of walk through this slowly. This is a Bayesian network. It looks a little different than the other Bayesian networks, but we've sort of isolated the pre and post-surgical variables in this net. So that's a preterm birth less than 37 weeks, or low birth weight that's less than 2.5 kilograms, or prolonged ventilation greater than 7 days after the first stage of the single ventricle palliation, which is typically a Norwood. The The PHN had demographic data in the form of detailed socioeconomic status information that was collated into sort of a number and then dichotomized into high socioeconomic status, which is good, or low socioeconomic status, which is not good. Our neurodevelopment outcomes were the PDI and the MDI, which are the Bayley's two indices, and height or length was represented as the length for age z-score. And then our genetics were the findings of whether that patient had a damaging variant in a syndromic gene or a damaging variant in a gene globally that can impact heart development. All right, so let's look at the results. So we're looking at the outcome of low MDI, and here we have a damaging variant. So a damaging genetic variant increases the risk of a low MDI by almost twofold. A patient that was on a ventilator for more than 7 days after their stage 1 palliative procedure, their risk of a low MDI is almost sixfold. But if they had both a damaging variant and prolonged ventilation, well, then you see how their risk increases up to 10.5-fold risk for a low MDI. And I'm going to give another example here for the low birth weight. So this is what's quite striking. So a damaging genetic variant in a gene that impacts heart development in this cohort overall did not result or did not associate with a low birth weight, right? That's 1.06, which is nothing basically. A baby that was born in a low socioeconomic status environment had an increased risk of about 1.7 of just being born small. Obviously, if you're born premature, you're going to likely have a low birth weight that increases your risk 8.2-fold. When we start adding these together, and again, this is where the Bayesian networks come in, a low socioeconomic status household and a preterm delivery now increases that risk of low birth weight 17.6-fold. And look what happens when we add damaging genetic variant now. We're talking a 25-fold increase in risk for low birth rate. So what these networks allow us to do is it allows us to find the genomic signal that's hidden in the data. If we look here, we'd be like, oh, hey, there's no impact of genetics on low birth weight, which is true when you look at the entire cohort. But when you look at subsets of the cohort, you can find that a damaging genetic variant is incredibly important, and it's in the context of preterm delivery and a low socioeconomic status. The next example I want to show you is data, again, from this is right out of the PCGC, the Pediatric Cardiac Genomics Consortium. This is a paper that's under review right now at Nature Communications. We have it in the public domain as a medRxiv manuscript, and the title is very important, and I selected this title for a very important reason. The title here is Genome Sequencing is Critical for Forecasting Outcomes Following Congenital Cardiac Surgery. So the data I'm going to show you supports this conclusion. The title makes it easy, I hope, in the future to get insurance companies to agree that the time is right for investing in genome sequencing in children undergoing critical congenital cardiac surgery. This study was in collaboration with the STS. So we have 2,200 probands with mostly complex heart disease that have whole exome data, and we have 45 pre and post-operative variables from the STS database. And before I go on, I just want to bring out this paper, which we published a couple of years ago, that shows that in this data set, the PCGC data set, it's really dominated by two general types of heart disease, genetic heart disease. One is recessive forms of congenital heart disease that are enriched in cilia-related genes that cause what's called heterotaxy phenotypes. Heterotaxy is where you have organ reversal and complex forms of congenital heart disease. De novo forms, that means the parents don't have the genetic variant, it spontaneously happened in the child. These forms of congenital heart disease have damaging variants in genes that are related to modifying the chromatin structure of the genome. And the reason why I'm introducing these 2 points is it's the genetic signals that we find that impact outcomes are in these two specific fields, or these two specific areas. So again, a complicated slide, but we'll walk through it carefully. But the take-home point is listed up here, and that is that damaging chromatin and cilia genotypes predict adverse postoperative events, but only in the context of congenital heart phenotypes and surgical complexity. So if you just say, well, what's the risk of death if you have a damaging variant? It's actually not predictive, right? But if you have a damaging genetic variant in a specific pathway, which is a chromatin gene, and you have had the most complex form of surgeries, which are STAT4, STAT5, then you have adverse outcomes with respect to prolonged ventilation, mortality, and cardiac arrest. And it's also true for the cilia damaging variants as well. And so let me just come back over here to this side of the statement. And what it's saying here is that of patients that die and underwent the most complex forms of surgery, a damaging genetic variant increased their risk of death 1.8-fold compared to not having a damaging variant. And likewise, if you died and had heterotaxy, having a damaging variant increased your risk of death 2.8-fold. And that was true as we cross cardiac arrest and ventilation. And one of the things I want to point out here is this down here at the bottom, where if patients that have heterotaxy and are on a ventilator for more than 7 days after cardiac surgery, they're 3.53 more likely to have a damaging cilia variant compared to individuals that don't. So we propose that knowledge of genomics is crucial for estimating the risk of adverse events after cardiac surgery, but it's in the context of specific CHD phenotypes. So that is left ventricular outflow tract obstruction lesions or heterotaxy lesions. It's in the context of extracardiac anomalies. I didn't show that data in the interest of time, but importantly, it's in the context of surgical complexity. So prolonged ventilation and mortality were predicted by damaging biallelic, this means recessive, cilia genotypes in the heterotaxy patients, and the damaging chromatin genotypes in patients with HLHS and other left ventricular outflow tract lesions. And this data is relevant in the context of a lot of work that's been done by Dr. Cecilia Lowe at the University of Pittsburgh, who really is, the world's expert on heterotaxy and cilia. And she's published a number of papers over the years showing the increased respiratory complications postoperatively in heterotaxy patients. And this is relevant because the data suggesting that we should be thinking about mucus clearance strategies in patients that have heterotaxy with a known cilia mutation, and that might be able to impact their clinical output and get them off a ventilator sooner rather than later. So that's the idea of how we hope that this paper, still under review, of course, can impact clinical care. So again, we're making progress in our journey, but again, still a long ways to go. And then just for the last couple of slides, I want to tell you about a new initiative that we just started this past summer here at Primary Children's. It's a $10.3 million initiative that's funded by the Warren Alpert Foundation and Primary Children's Philanthropy. And this is to genome sequence 4,500 children over the next 3 years. This is to provide them a lifelong personal genome, but it also allows us now to deploy our EHR and genomic-based AI tools to advance precision medicine at scale. So this is how we're thinking of sort of the layout, and this is really what we've proposed and what we have actually done with the Pediatric Cardiac Genomics Consortium, or the PCGC. This was also part of our Utah Pediatric Heart Network, or PHN renewal, and that is we need to be extracting data across multiple sites and integrating that information with genomic information. And so here we propose we'll be pulling out a series of clinical variables from the EHR. We've done this. This was the data I showed you from University of Utah. It includes some demographic and social determinants of health data. In addition, we're using natural language processing to process every single clinic note to pull out relevant terms. These are called human phenotype ontology, or HPO terms, to pull out terms that might be missed in ICD-9 and 10, right? The purpose of ICD-9 10 is billing. It's not really meant to be used to define a phenotype. Whereas the structured notes give us a phenotype. Not listed here is the ECHO database, which we also compute on, which give us the key terms for congenital heart disease. Integrate this with DNA, and then create our Utah Patient Disease Network, deploy our AI tools on that, and then develop these what we call web-based risk calculators, where clinicians can go in and say, my patient is a 1 week old patient with Downs and has complete AV canal and has esophageal atresia. What's the risk that they'll be on a ventilator for more than 7 days after their first heart surgery? Or what's their risk of having whatever growth anomalies, whatever over time? All of these things we can make risk predictions about as we move forward and do this over the course of the next several years. So our goal really is to calculate individual risk for any pediatric disorder affecting Utah children by integrating the clinical variables, the social determinants of health variables, with the genetic results out of this GeneKids study across a whole array of childhood disorders. So what are the next steps? Well, I think the key thing here, the key thing here is we need more data. As crazy as that sounds, we have all these networks in pediatric cardiology, PC4, IMPACT, STS, CNOC. These are all huge databases filled with data from across the country, but they don't talk to each other. So what we really need is a mechanism for getting all of that data out and being able to compute on it all at once. And the computation is not difficult. What's difficult is getting the permission of all those individuals who are leading those consortia to say, yes, we're okay with doing this. So the computations are trivial given the power of AI tools. The challenges are in getting people on board and permissions to do that. Another alternative to that would be to combine clinical sequencing data. So as whole genome sequencing in the NICU and cardiac ICU becomes the standard of care state by state, paid for by insurance companies, paid for by Medicaid in each state, then we're really going to scale up on sequencing data. And what we need is a mechanism for hospitals to share their data for the good of all children in research, but to share that data broadly, obviously de-identified, and integrate the clinical sequencing with the EHR data, as well as social determinants of health. I think that's the path moving forward. The PCGC is sunsetting as of July or August of this year. The PCGC will essentially shut down. The PHN is ongoing, but these big databases that have sequencing capacity and sequencing data are going to be, integrated into a big sharing system called NIH.Biodata Catalyst. But I'm worried that might make it difficult for people to access that data at scale. What we really need is hospitals sharing data in a safe manner and as de-identified as possible, and then integrating that with genomics to really understand risk across all disease specialties. Whoops, and even though the talk is over, I can definitely say that this journey that we're on, at least in Utah and across the country, is not yet over. This road winds on and on and on, and there's still a lot to be discovered, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'd like to thank everyone's attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you so the online people can hear. We're also monitoring chat for questions as well, so that's open.
Thank you so much. This was a really interesting look at a practical use of Bayesian inference. And related to that, I had a question about your socioeconomic status variable. Could you talk more about what you use to make that variable, and is it standardized across other study designs? So that might be a long answer, but thanks.
No. Thank you very much. That's actually a really good question. So for each study, there's a slightly different variable. For the Pediatric Heart Network study collaboration, they had a whole series of questions and questionnaires, and they created an index for socioeconomic status. And then they had already decided how did they divide it into good versus bad. So it's dichotomized, and it misses a lot of nuance, right? When you do the dichotomy, where the dichotomy helps you is in the computation. So each of these variables that I showed in the Bayesian networks is a yes/no variable. So for example, that SES was good, bad. You can have like 3 different options, or you could have 4 different options. What happens is the computation gets incredibly complex the more states you have. So, right now for every variable, there is the number of variables, which is n, raised to the power of the states. So in our what I showed you were 2 states, so that's n to the 2nd power. So if you have 15 variables, you square that, and that's the number of different individual calculations you'd have to make. If you have 3 states or 4, it'll be 10 to the 3rd or 10 to the 4th. So the computational time increases dramatically when you are not binary. So that was the PHN. For the adult atrial fibrillation study, we used a geocoded based social determinant of health. So it's based on the last zip code that we have in the EHR, which gives you information about, who lives in that zip code and what their earning power is in general, what their education level is, what their distance to medical care is, and things like that. So that's a composite value, which has its advantages and disadvantages. But something that we did recently, and this is part of one of my adult colleagues' R01 proposal, is we bought data from a commercial vendor. It's 134 variables, which have been adjudicated by the PCORNet people to be a reflection of social determinants of health. And we're in the process of taking those 134 variables and seeing if we can find a way again to make a composite number for easy calculations. But just so you understand the scope of this vendor scans all Americans' activities and has incredible data about every single one of us. One of the variables we could have if we wanted it is, does the person own an RV? And does a person own an RV, and has that person taken a trip to Canada in their RV? So this is the level of detail that people have from every time we say okay or consent when we use any social media site. We are incredibly tracked, and information is there. And it's not like the Chinese are going to get that from TikTok. They already have this. They don't need TikTok to get this information, right? It's crazy. But there were individuals at our center that were like, well, wait a second, is it right for you to purchase this information and have it on individual members of the UHealth system? And ultimately, the lawyers said, this is fine. And so, we're sort of in that process of bringing that data together to make it more solid in the realm of social determinants of health. So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
Any other question?
Oh, great talk. Thanks. So there are a bunch of clinicians in this room, and I'm wondering if you could make a leap for us, talking about big data and large trends. I'm wondering, if a clinician is in clinic and want to use this kind of information about making decisions for their patients, how is that translation, if you will, going to occur?
Yeah, so we're in the process of transitioning to that and thinking about what that would look like. And so we've created these nets as part of some of the first publications that we had, and they are, computable. We posted them on the web. You can like download them and, say what would happen if my patient had this, this, and this within the context of like atrial fibrillation, for instance, and calculate different types of risks. So we want to get there eventually. We still have a lot of computation to go. And, I think where we really want to see is we want to see what do these trends look like outside of University of Utah's EHR, right? Like Utah is a discrete and it's a unique place in many ways. And the advantage of using, like local data is you can say, well, those are the outcomes that happen here in Salt Lake. But when we think more broadly about how these clinical variables interact with social determinants of health and genomics, we need to be looking across multiple institutions where there are greater numbers of African Americans, greater numbers of Hispanic ancestries. And then we can sort of get a global view of how all these variables interact. But I do think having the information from your own center matters because those are the outcomes that are driven in your own center when it comes to, say, surgical outcomes.
Marty, this is Lars Grosse-Wortmann. Brilliant talk and very inspiring. Maybe as a follow-up question to Michael's, what pretty much everything you've talked about and certainly the vision you've shared requires highly specialized experts that do this. Do you envision that this skill and this tool, which is hopefully going to become, is going to be in some way centralized to very few centers that provide that, where we would then set up, upload our clinical data and we'll get a response? Or do you envision more of a decentralized solution, or is it going to be part of our EHR as a decision-making aid? What's your vision of where that all lives?
Thank you for that question, because I wanted to really address that point, because that's something about the future and the future workforce. So if I can just begin the question with the rapid whole genome sequencing, which is happening in the NICUs and cardiac ICUs across the country, that wave is spreading. And it is incredibly complex information and nuanced information. And we need people who understand those nuances and are able to explain those nuances to our clinical colleagues. Not everyone is going to be an expert in this space, just like I would never go to the cath lab and try and balloon an aortic valve, right? That's not my skill set anymore. So we have to have specialized people to do this, but we need to be training the future generation of precision medicine advocates. And so that, we have one person here who has done a 4th year in kind of precision medicine. And the idea is, her role would be to help interpret these genetic variants and potentially have something that we would call genome rounds. So once a week in the cardiac ICU or in the NICU, walking around to every bedside with a clinical team and have this genomics enabled person there to provide this interpretation in that context. Stepping further away and into the broader picture, I think we need the EHR vendors' help in sharing this information and integrating this information in a way that provides the right clinical decision support tools for the clinicians. Utah just got accepted into another network. It's called the Genomics Enabled Learning Health System Network, with Vanderbilt and Geisinger and other sort of powerhouses in genomics. And that consortium is trying to accomplish things on a much, much smaller scale than that, but integrating genomics into the EHR in a way that busy clinicians can utilize that information and have it not slow down their clinics. So things have to be made easy, and those things have to come through the EHR vendors.
We have one more question in the chat that we can address, and then unfortunately we have to adjourn. There was a question on whether you've sought any feedback from patient advocates, patient input on how that type of vision is perceived, especially the integration of socioeconomic status and social determinants of health. Are you in touch with patient advocate groups about this, or do you think that's necessary?
Yeah, it is absolutely necessary. And for a lot of the NIH grants, it's a requirement that you have patient advocates on your team and that they're part of the decision-making process. And so, especially in the field of genomics, we need to have buy-in from the key stakeholders, of which the families are one of those key stakeholders. In the area of rapid genome sequencing, in the area of genome sequencing in the cardiac ICU, overwhelmingly parents are on board. There's still some parents that will decline genomic testing for their own reasons, but the majority of parents do agree and are interested in having return of results. And we have a whole series of surveys that we survey the parents to get sort of their input, and focus groups with parents as well.
Thank you very much for that. I would love to continue this Q&A, but we are at time. Thank you so much again, Dr. Tristani-Firouzi, for your fantastic talk, and thanks to everybody in the audience and virtually.